standing outside the Hub Culture Pavilion in Davos. Very pleased to be joined by a repeat guest, Mark Malloch-Brown. Thank you very much for coming along. Now, you are leading a new commission which is bringing business into sustainable development. Tell me why that's happened.
Well, these ambitions of these new sustainable development goals are just so large and that it will exhaust any public resources available to meet them. I mean, just to give you a sense of the scale, global development assistance, official development assistance, is about $120 billion plus a year. The cost estimates of these new sustainable development goals is a few $1 trillion a year. So there's a massive gap which can only be plausibly bridged by the private sector coming in. But of course, the private sector are only going to come in if activities which have in the past been grant-making activities are transformed through new business models into for-profit activities. So it's not just a new source of money, it's a transformation of the concept of how development happens to give it a shape where the ultimate beneficiaries, through becoming consumers and users of services they're paying for, become ultimately the financiers of their own development.
It's a great idea, but give me some concrete examples of where you've seen businesses taking on the role that formerly we saw coming from overseas development aid.
Well, years ago I worked at the World Bank and we were exiting sectors where we saw business come in. We saw in quite a lot of the sort of then energy sector, across quite a lot of infrastructure sectors, that these had become investable and bankable, and therefore the World Bank could start pulling out and focusing its resources on the sectors which couldn't yet attract private finance. And that's always been the way this has to go. The sheer quantum and scale doesn't allow the public sector to do it alone. And so, if you look now at infrastructure across the Asian or African continent, a growing proportion year on year is privately funded. If you take many African countries, they in recent years have gone onto the capital markets, listed Eurobonds, raised debt finance of different kinds. If you look at a sector which you might think is a long way from the private sector, like education, you're seeing increasingly, particularly at the secondary and tertiary levels, private provided education. And, in fact, to take education as example, international public finance from the UNICEFs and World Bank and others involved in the education sector is a few points of the total volume of money spent, which comes from governments, but also comes from parents paying formally or informally for their kids' schooling. And so, this need to, as I say, turn today's poor into tomorrow's consumer, whose prospects of their using these services allows you to fund their development, knowing that there's a market for them once you've built them, is in a sense the model we need to move a lot of development to.
So I know that Paul Pullman, who's your co-chairman on this initiative, has said that poverty isn't in anyone's business model. However, it seems like investing in a future market might be a spend that could be pushed away if we saw the global economy, which doesn't look on very certain ground, take a downward turn. How can you ensure against that?
Well, Paul Pullman, as CEO of Unilever, has banished quarterly earnings reports. He's insisted very successfully to his investors and to the market that he's to be judged by a longer term frame. And I think, that has got to be part of this. We are in a period of some market turmoil. A lot of investors are looking longingly at the American greenback and the American economy as a safe haven in these difficult times. But the truth is, look forward 10 or 20 years, and the future markets are not in the US or Europe. The demographic growth, the income growth, the need for new city infrastructure, the need for broader categories of infrastructure like sustainable energy is going to be very heavily weighted towards developing countries. You look at almost any report by the likes of McKinsey or the World Bank or others on where middle class growth is going to occur in the world, and it's in those kinds of markets. So, this does require investors to exercise strategic patience and long-term vision. But, ultimately, their shareholders and successors of tomorrow will thank them for making that bet now.
Slightly off topic, but I wonder if these same businesses, if they're interested in helping out with the Sustainable Development Goals, would also be interested in helping out with the other major issue of this year, which is, of course, the refugee crisis. And can you see any interest of the private sector being aligned there?
Well, I think that this is more, frankly, the private sector through its own philanthropic activities rather than its investment activities. That said, the founder of Chobani Yogurt has been a big force at this year's Davos with his argument that he and his yogurt factories is employing a very significant number of refugees, but also through his philanthropic activities is providing support to the whole sort of refugee flow from point of source to country of final resettlement, and is encouraging other firms to join him in that.
It's hard if the country that they're living in, though, has laws that protect against that, right?
Well, that's right. No, and there's a lot of stuff to be done to try and get work permits and all the rest. If you arrive in America as a refugee, you're allowed to work from day one, and that gets you very quickly off the public purse and being a cost to government, and gets refugees, who tend to be some of the most dynamic, motivated people possible because of what they've escaped, gets them on their feet very quickly. So in that way, refugees who, in whether it's the US, UK, continental Europe, there are stories from all those countries of the economic contribution refugees have made, the speed with which they've integrated and become extraordinary leaders in their new societies. All of that is encouraging of a kind of, if you like, a sort of private sector support. But for companies to actually invest in sort of refugees is a hard sell. And I actually think what's really going to happen is that you're going to see official development assistance more and more concentrated on support to refugees, broader humanitarian causes, to weak and failed states, typically the producers of these human flows, leaving the sort of more stable middle income countries to an increasingly private sector led model of development.
Mark, thank you very much for stopping by the Hub Culture Pavilion here in Davos, and I'm Edie Rush.